Hi, this is Nicholas Yock, a registered education and migration agent from Pathway to Oz. Today I'm going to discuss with you, how to pass a skill assessment as a carpenter. So in order to apply literally for any permanent, work visa to Australia, you will usually need to pass a skill assessment. The skill assessment for the occupation of carpenter is done through an organisation called Trades Recognition Australia. What is a skill assessment and why do you need it? Well, look, a skill assessment basically ensures that, you have the relevant skills and education and work experience in the occupation to work in that occupation in Australia. The Australian immigration system doesn't understand, exactly what requirements are needed to work as a carpenter or specific occupations in Australia. So they give this job to Trades Recognition Australia, who specialise in trades. So they will ensure that you have the relevant work experience, qualifications to meet the Australian standards for your occupation. So as mentioned before, having a skill assessment is the very first step to applying for any permanent visa. So the skilled independent, subclass 190, even the skilled work regional or the permanent employer sponsored. Do I need to do any practical tests to pass the skill assessment? For the occupation of carpenter, look, you may be required to do a practical assessment, but more importantly, they're just going to look at your education and your work experience to ensure you meet the requirements. To pass a skill assessment, there's a few different sort of streams of it for a carpenter. So the first stream is that obviously if you've studied or learnt to be a carpenter overseas. So as a general rule of thumb, to pass a skill assessment as a carpenter, if you've studied and worked overseas, you would need to have the equivalent of the Australian Cert 3 in carpentry, plus 3 years post-qualification work experience. So, your qualification, plus then 3 years after that. For example, someone in England might have like an NVQ level 3 or NVQ level 2 potentially, depending how long it took, plus then 3 years post-qualification work experience to pass that skill assessment. Another way to pass a skill assessment is through basically studying to be a carpenter in Australia. So in Australia, you can study to be a carpenter in as little as 2 years. Once you've studied, you should be able to then obtain what's called a graduate work visa, which allows you to remain in Australia upon completion of the course. You'd then need to work in the industry for at least 12 months and go through a process called the Job Ready program, in which afterwards you should be able to obtain a skill assessment. So the Australian government allows you to obtain a skill assessment as a carpenter with only 1 year work experience if you study in Australia, as opposed to if you study overseas. And the relevance to that is that the Australian government is trying to encourage people to study in Australia. So they've shortened the amount of time you needed post-qualification work experience. So the only other sort of relevant, assessment for a carpenter would be, for example, if you've let's say you've worked in the industry overseas for 8 years, 10 years, or even in Australia for a really long time, but you don't have a qualification. So a lot of people are sort of in that situation. If you are, you would first need to obtain a Cert 3 in carpentry through recognised prior learning, and you would then need to demonstrate to Trades Recognition Australia that you have at least 6 years of relevant work experience. So it's a lot longer than, say, if you actually have a relevant qualification or if you study in Australia. So what documents do you need to provide for a skill assessment? Well, obviously, your education documents, so a full education transcript, sort of detailing what you covered. If you did an apprenticeship, your apprenticeship contract and things like that. You'll also need to provide work experience documentation, so letters of reference from your employer, pay slips, tax assessments, and things of that nature. What if I can't pass a skill assessment? Well, look, if you can't pass a skill assessment, it's going to be very difficult to obtain a permanent visa to Australia. You could consider studying, you could consider, going back overseas, gaining the additional work experience or something like that. But there's no sort of clear path. If you don't pass a skill assessment, you won't be able to apply for those permanent work visas in the future. Look, I hope this gives you a sort of general overview of the requirements to pass a skill assessment as a carpenter. If you do have any questions, feel free to contact Pathway to Oz. All our details are below and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.